Hi, welcome to this tech talk titled Kanban, an Alternative to Scrum, ? And I'm Kevin Smith, and I'll be giving this talk. So, who am I? As I said, I'm Kevin Smith. I'm an Agile Coach here at the Wikimedia Foundation. On email and other places, I'm K Smith, and on IRC, I'm Meeple27. My background is as a software developer, mostly in C++ and Java, but I've been interested in Agile processes for a long time. So a little history about Kanban. It was developed by Toyota, the car company, starting in the 1940s, and they did it to improve auto manufacturing efficiency. But later, a lot of the ideas were applied to other processes, including software development and information technology work. Kanban is a very open-ended framework, as I'll sort of get into some more details of that. When I first started reading about it, it was hard for me to understand what it even was. The descriptions were so vague and hand-wavy that it's like, well, what do you do? What does it look like on a day-to-day basis? It was hard to get that information until I found the right sources. There's a lot of information out there. Which leads me to the land of confusion. So when you're talking about Kanban with anyone, it's important to make sure that you're talking about the same thing, because Kanban means different things to different people. So there are a number of different possible definitions of Kanban. It's a system for lean manufacturing, as I mentioned, that Toyota developed. But technically, the word Kanban actually means the card or the piece of paper that's used as the signal in the Kanban process. Kanban is often used as a meta process for improving any process. So it's not really a process; it's a process about a process. And then a lot of people consider it to be an agile software development process. And I'll pause here and mention that if you have questions, feel free to just drop in maybe at the end of a slide or just when you feel like you have a question. So on that last slide, I had some question marks out after Kanban being a process, and that's because one of the pioneers of the Kanban method says Kanban is not a software development lifecycle or project management methodology. It's not a way of making software or running projects that make software, which sounds like it's a contradiction to what a lot of people view Kanban as. And
quick question, Kevin.
Yes.
Regarding the previous slide, what's the recommended source for further reading?
I will have references at the end in the slide deck, which will be published.
Okay, great.
Sorry. So for this talk, Kanban is a very light framework. So it's not a process. It doesn't tell you exactly what to do, but it's a way of thinking that can let you. Very light, upon which a team can build. So the team actually has to take this and turn it into their own process. A lean and agile software development process. Lean is closely related to agile. For the purposes of this talk, you can sort of consider them the same thing. They have similar roots and similar ideas. So Kanban, I mentioned, it's a very light framework. So you may have heard of the waterfall method. Modern approach that's a waterfall-y thing is called V model. Apparently it's used in some military applications and things like that. And those kinds of processes, waterfall itself can be light or can be heavy, whatever, but those types of processes tend to be very heavyweight, very prescriptive. So this is just kind of, it tells you how to gather requirements, when to gather requirements, how to document your requirements, how to cross-reference your requirements. And then you get into your design and your analysis, and it just, at each step of the way, it tends to tell you, you will do it this way, you must do this, you must do this, you must do this. So the Agile software development movement was sort of in response to that, and so extreme programming was one of the earlier Agile methodologies. And it has certain things that you have to do. If you're doing extreme programming, you are pair programming all the time. You are having the planning meetings. Your product manager, essentially, your customer, is on site with the team. And so there are these fairly strict rules that you have to be doing these things to be doing extreme programming. So it's not as prescriptive as the V model, but there's some things you have to do. Scrum is sort of the next step lighter, where with Scrum you'll have your product owner, your Scrum Master, your team, you'll have fixed iterations of typically 2 or 3 weeks, not more than a month, and you'll have daily stand-ups, and and that's about it. So it's very light still. There's not much that you have to be doing to say that you're doing Scrum. Kanban is even lighter. Basically, it's this sort of empty platform upon which you can decide to build your own process. It doesn't say that you'll have daily meetings. It doesn't say that you'll have a product owner. It doesn't say that you'll estimate your tasks. That's why I consider it to be very light. So to talk about Kanban, just to get a little more specific, there are a lot of flavors of Kanban and takes on Kanban, and the one that I've sort of zeroed in on is called Open Kanban. There's a link to it here. And it's just a specific way of talking about Kanban. It's aimed at software development projects or other IT projects, so that's handy for what we do here. It's also released under the Creative Commons, which is nice because you can redistribute it, interpret it, adjust it to however works for you. It's still at a more conceptual level, not a practical level, so it won't tell you to do pair programming or not, or have a product manager or not. But at least it's a, as I'll show you, they have these practices. So the practices are not, again, at that detailed level, but these are the things that you do if you're doing Open Kanban. So first is to visualize the workflow. So you're doing work, it's moving from person to person, station to station, process to process, whatever. They want you to visualize that somehow. How you do that is up to you. Team approach with leadership. This is the sort of the outlier bullet point. I don't know why they included this as one of the 4 of Open Kanban. It's not part of typical traditional Kanban, but yeah, you'll have a team and it'll have some leadership. Reduce batch size, and also they don't mention it in Open Kanban, but it's closely related to limiting work in progress, WIP. And so I'll talk quite a bit more about that. And then finally, continual improvement and learning is always a very big part of Kanban. The idea is that on an hourly basis, daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis, you're continually looking at how you're doing, evaluating, looking for ways to improve and learn and do better. So the first bullet point was visualizing the workflow. And the simplest way to do this is it's on a workboard. And a typical Kanban workboard looks a lot like a Scrum workboard. It looks a lot like the workboards that we have in Fabricator here. You have columns for the different phases that a task is going to go through. So here you can see that support IE9 is a task that we hope to do sometime soon. Somebody is currently working on adding a sort button. It's in progress. A bug and a feature have been coded, but they're in review right now. And then a couple of items have already been done and released, presumably, or at least released to the next step, whatever that is. So there are other ways of visualizing your workflow, and one of them is a cumulative flow diagram. And there's an example here. It's kind of like a burn-down chart or a burn-up chart on steroids, if you're familiar with those. And so essentially, time is going across left to right, and the number of items or the number of story points or whatever you measure in is going on the vertical axis. And so you can see that on day 1, there's a lot of stuff in the backlog, the light blue, and nothing's been done yet. And then as time goes on, things go into development, which is the green, and then they move into test, which is orange, and then they move into production, which is the dark blue. So on any given day, you can see the distance between the dark blue line and the top of the light blue is your work in progress. Those are the things that are either in your backlog, or they're in your development, or they're being tested. Going the other way, you can see the yellow arrow at the 10, where basically something that entered the system on day 4 exited on day, was that 10? So that means that there's 6 days from when it went into the backlog until it came out into production. And that's not to say that one task exactly took 6 days to move there, because it could have been that one task got stalled and some other tasks bypassed it. But on average, that's the lead time from when something enters the system till when it exits the system. Yes?
Is this essentially what some people call a burnout chart?
It is, right. A burnout chart is typically if you took out the dark blue, orange, and if you took off the light blue, green, and orange and just looked at what was actually in production, that would be a burnout chart. And this just adds additional information to it. There's also cycle time and lead time are closely related. Essentially, cycle time would be from where it transitions from light blue into green, from that point over to the dark blue. And it's essentially where lead time is from when it enters the backlog until it gets delivered. Cycle time is from when it starts to be worked on until it gets delivered. So they're somewhat interchangeable depending on how precise you need to be about one versus the other.
Hey, Kevin?
Yes?
Is there no sort of sprints in this? I notice it sort of never goes down, but I mean, do you have sprints, or does it just keep going more and more and more?
Right. So the short answer is it does not. You do not necessarily have sprints. This particular cumulative flow diagram is only 2 weeks, so it could be within a sprint time frame. But Kanban does not require sprints. And this chart could be graphed over 1 week, or it could be graphed over a whole year. So the next main point of the Kanban practices was reduce batch size. And so, well, what's a batch size? So batch size is the quantity of work that passes from one stage to the next. So if we look at those work boards, a task as it moves across the board, that's a batch. So somebody worked on feature X, and then it went into testing, and then it went into deployment. That was a batch moving across the system. At a different level, in Scrum, where you have these fixed iterations, you work on something, you test it, you get it all ready, and then at the end of the sprint, you release it, you deploy it, whatever. So at that level, everything that you've done in those, let's say, 2 weeks, is a batch itself, because as far as the customer is concerned, the person actually using the website at the end, anything that you did on days 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they don't see it. They don't see it until it actually gets released. And so at that level, Scrum typically has a 2 week or 1 week or 3 week batch size. Small batches are nice for a number of reasons. They're more predictable. It's easier to estimate small amounts of work. They tighten feedback loops, because the smaller amount of work you deliver to the customer, the faster they can tell you what they like about it or don't like about it. They generally improve agility. If you have 5 small tasks, then the product owner can rearrange those in whatever way makes sense, whereas if they're all considered part of one big story, then you lose that control. So there are a number of nice reasons to have smaller batches. So the flip side of that is to minimize the work in progress, WIP. And so if you look at that, work in progress is everything that you started but you haven't finished. And by reducing that, you get a number of benefits as well. So one thing is you improve your focus. If you're doing 6 things at once, you're not sure what you're doing and you have to remember them all. If you have one thing you're doing, you know what you're doing, you're focused on it. Right along with that, that minimizes context switching. So if you're working on 3 things at once and each day you're working on a different one, and then you go back and work on the first one again, you have to relearn kind of what you forgot. So if you can be doing just one thing at a time, that reduces or eliminates context switching. It can also avoid creating output that's never used. And a great example of this is the code review question that's sort of been popping up on mailing lists recently. Is we have a lot of these patches that haven't been reviewed for weeks or months, and they're just sitting out there essentially rotting. So there may be a number of those that it turns out that the code has moved so far forward since that patch was done that that patch just isn't mergeable or doesn't even make sense. So that means that that patch at that point is total waste. If somebody did the work and it was for nothing. And so by minimizing that work, all of those patches that are waiting to be reviewed are work in progress. And by reducing that reduces the chances of wasting effort for that reason. Minimizing work in progress improves flow. It delivers value earlier. So if you're juggling 3 things and you get all 3 of them done before you hand them to the user, maybe you finished one and you got the other 2 80% done before the customer saw anything, that's going to take a while. Whereas if you can start one thing and finish it and hand it to the user, then they get their value as early as possible. And so there's a Kanban saying, stop starting and start finishing. So it's typical in Kanban to enforce WIP limits. And the way this can be done, and this is supported in Fabricator, is you can actually establish WIP limits for each of your columns in your work board. And so in this particular project, they happen to say that they can have up to 5 items in backlog, up to 3 in progress, up to 2 in needs review. So if you look at in progress, you've got task B there, which is already, the coding's done, but there's no room for it in the needs review column because the needs review column is full of its WIP limit is reached. There's 2 items there, so nothing can get pulled in from the in progress column until either task C or task F gets reviewed and shifted to done. You'll notice that also in progress has only 2 items in it right now, and so there is room to pull a task in from the backlog. So at this point, a developer or the product owner, somebody would pull probably task G into in progress, and somebody could start working on that.
Hey, Kevin, 2 questions.
Yeah.
Well, first a comment. The sprint extension in Fabricator, I believe, has you can limit the number of stuff in the column. I don't know if anyone's turned that on. Has anyone turned that on?
Yeah, there's some teams that use it, and it doesn't actually enforce a hard limit, but it does flag that you're over the limit.
It goes red. It shows you you're violating it.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, so I don't understand, if you limit the number, you can't, if you limit the backlog to 5, what do you do with your 400 tasks? Are they in a backlog of the backlog?
Right, that would be the typical way that this would be the backlog of stuff that we're working on, that it's shovel ready, it's been defined, and we know it's high priority and we're going to be working on it. The list of the product backlog, so this would be the equivalent of a Scrum sprint backlog.
Okay.
The product backlog, which has the 500 items, which are in various states of definition, would probably be stored somewhere else. They could be stored in another column here, but this team hasn't chosen to do that.
We keep ours in another board, and we find it to be less stressful because we don't see all the things that we haven't done.
Right.
So, yeah, what do you still call it for a new, so you have a sprint backlog, do you call it backlog in that thing? It's kind of confusing.
Our board is called backlog, and then we have a column that's like next up, which is the equivalent of the backlog column here.
Right. So the backlog column here could be called to do. It could be called ready.
Right. Yeah, I was looking at so it's kind of like a to do thing.
Yeah. So whatever terminology makes sense for that team.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. All right. So this is kind of to show how batch size and WIP work together. So the goal is to deliver completed work to each following stage as often as possible. And typically you would do that by reducing batch size and by minimizing your WIP. So at the far left, we have these 3 tasks that need to be done. Each one, let's say each one's a week long. And you've got 3 developers, and each one's going to take on one of those tasks. So the soonest the customer's going to see anything is about a week from now, which is not great. That's a fairly long time. Let's say it's a month. Let's say it's whatever scale you want. It's a long time. So in the second column, this team decided to reduce their WIP, and so they said we will not have more than 5 days worth of work to do at a time in the progress column, and so that would end up in this case forcing all 3 developers to work on the same task. But it's still a 1-week task, so there's still nothing that you're going to be able to hand to the testers or users or whoever in a day or 2. probably, this is very abstracted. In this case, you probably wouldn't actually put 3 developers on one single task because they'd be stepping all over each other. You could certainly put 2 on a task as a pair programming or pairing exercise. And in fact, that may make sense if it's a high priority, tricky bit of work. But so gloss over that and say just conceptually you're applying these people to this large batch. So the next column is, now we've said we haven't explicitly limited WIP, but we've broken things into small batches. So now each of those large tasks has been split into 2 or 3 smaller ones, and each developer can work on the big task. But in this case, the top developer is kind of bouncing back and forth between these 2 parts, and the second developer is bouncing both back and forth between those 2 parts, and the bottom developer is bouncing. So you still have context switching. You still have, the users. Those tasks are not going to get delivered as quickly as possible to the next stage. So the final column is combining both of these, where the tasks have been broken up into these small batches, and we've made an effort to reduce the work in progress. And so each developer is focused on just one piece at a time. And you can see that there's that little sliver, maybe it's a day of work, and the tester is going to have something to look at. And then after another day, the tester is going to have some more to look at. And so it starts to create this flow of work through the system. So Kanban really is about continuous flow. To re-answer your question from earlier, Kanban does not require fixed length iterations. And so if you think of, so Scrum has fixed iterations, typically a couple of weeks. At the start of it, you decide how much work, decide exactly what work you're planning to do during that time. It's all estimated. You're pretty confident you can get it done. You work during the sprint to get it done, and then you deliver it. So it's sort of like you're going to faucet, filling a bucket, and then pouring the bucket onto the fire or whatever you're doing. Kanban is much more like a hose. Stuff comes in and stuff goes out, and it's just this continual motion of work. So Kanban does not require fixed length iterations, which as a side effect of that, tasks don't have to be estimated. You're no longer working towards, you no longer have to figure out what's going to fit in your time-boxed iteration. So work shows up and you do the work. Work shows up and you do the work. There's still benefits to doing estimation, but it's not required by Kanban. Developers tend to like that because developers tend to be, often are unhappy giving estimates and being stuck with those estimates later. Stories can be added or removed at any time. So in Scrum, once you have that sprint defined, technically nothing should be added to the sprint, nothing should be removed from the sprint. And the idea is you can always wait a couple of weeks, and however important it was, don't worry about it, it'll be in the next sprint in a couple of weeks. With Kanban, in that backlog column on the workboard that we saw, whoever's doing the prioritization has the flexibility and freedom to be able to add stories or remove stories at any time, as long as they haven't actually, as long as the work hasn't started on them yet, they can change their minds up to the last minute. And so product owners tend to like that flexibility. The product can be released at any time. A lot of companies now are actually moving towards continuous deployment. So we actually, we could get to the point where a product owner would say, "Yep, this is great." They push a button at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday, and it goes live to the site. And then at 8 o'clock the next morning, somebody checked in some really cool stuff later that afternoon. Oh, let's release that again. And you could even get to the point where, as soon as the code gets merged, it automatically got pushed out to the site. Obviously, for that to work, you'd have to have awesome automated testing and other things in place. It's kind of a dream in a sense, but there are companies that are actually doing it, so it is possible. And Kanban, that fits well with Kanban, with this idea that the work is just continually flowing through the system, and anything that's stopping it is kind of getting in the way. Maybe you need to, but maybe you don't. So a drawback with this continuous flow and tasks not being estimated is it can be harder to predict when a large specific feature set will get done. It's a common problem in any software development to try to predict up front, hey, we have this amount of work to do, when's it going to be finished? But extreme programming and Scrum have this concept of velocity that's pretty well cooked into the system, and you have to be doing estimates, and so you can build up these reasonable predictions, or as good as possible predictions of when this amount of scope will get done. It's a little harder in Kanban. You can get pretty close to that, though, if you're doing estimates and you're measuring, you're using those continuous flow diagrams or similar tools. You can actually measure essentially how fast your estimated work is moving through the system, and therefore, in the future, how fast your estimated work is likely to move through the system. But it's definitely less developed than Scrum in that sense.
Sorry, it strikes me there's a couple of things there. Firstly, you would have to, like a big complicated feature, you divide it into a bunch of little pieces, and then, presumably somebody's moving the right little pieces onto the backlog. But you'd have to, so the first thing is deploying them, you'd have to have them under behind feature flags or something so that you'd be able to see, oh, this tiny little piece of the complete search rewrite is working. But, you obviously users can't see that because you've only done one piece. But then how do you keep track of, well, before we can actually have the new search, we've got to have all of these 9 pieces done. You've got to have some sort of higher level thing tracking all the elements you need. Otherwise, you might wind up having 7 small pieces of your big rewrite, but not the remaining 2.
Right. Which is true in Scrum or anything that has to be managed.
Yeah.
And so that as far as the continual deployment, that would be more of an issue.
Right.
You'd have to be careful there that everything that you do doesn't make the site any worse. It may not make it any better because the feature is hidden or it's only half there, but as long as it doesn't make it work, it's okay to push it. But yes, that would be the responsibility of the presumably product owner to do the sequencing and the actual decision to release or not release based on what makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So there are a couple terms, Scrum Butt and Scrum Bon. So Scrum Butt is when a team says, well, we're doing Scrum, but... so examples of this would be that they're doing most of the Scrum practices, but they don't actually commit to what they're going to get done during a sprint. They do their estimations, they do their, they lay out their sprint plan, but they make it, they don't make it, it's not really a big deal. Or maybe they don't have the daily Scrum meetings that Scrum says that you will have. Very few teams really are 100% pure Scrum. I don't know, I have no idea what a percentage is, but it's so easy to deviate a little bit. It's like, well, okay, we don't need to do a retrospective every single sprint. Or we're only going to, we're going to do the sprint review, but we're not going to do, or maybe the whole team is not cross-functional, or the whole team isn't in on the sprint planning. There are a lot of reasons that it may make sense for that team not to do 100% pure Scrum. So Scrum Butt is actually pretty common, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. But just be aware that if you're not doing Scrum, then don't blame Scrum if it's not working. Scrum Bon is a mix of Scrum and Kanban. It's a pretty vague term. People toss around it. It has some meaning. You've taken some of the aspects of Scrum. Maybe you have a product owner, and maybe you have daily meetings. But then it's maybe you don't have fixed length iterations, but maybe you do. People could say Scrum Bon can be applied to something that's really very much like Scrum with a little bit of Kanban, or very much like Kanban with a little bit of Scrum. So be careful if you use that word. That again, you may not be meaning what the other person thinks you mean. So when to consider Kanban? It's really ideal when the upcoming work is unpredictable. So if it's highly event-driven, help desk tickets coming in, you don't know on Monday whether you're going to get 3 customer problems or 30 customer problems. You don't know if they're going to be, just a quick 1-minute answer or a 5-day research project. So under those circumstances, obviously, coming up with a sprint plan that covers 2 weeks is very challenging. And so event-driven teams might favor Kanban. Another example is research tasks with significant true unknowns. I'm trying to qualify as many significant, true, real, full unknowns. Everything in software development is unknowns. You're always inventing something when you're writing software. But with a research task, you might actually be presented with a problem that it might end up not being solvable, and you might not know that for a month. Or you might have to invent something that you might have the right insight and it might be done in 2 hours, and if you don't get that insight, then maybe it'll take you 2 weeks. So it's at that level that, again, Kanban starts to make a lot of sense because of the unpredictability. Other places it can work well, teams that are very mature, if they're hitting limitations of Scrum, they've been doing Scrum for a while, it's been working, but those 2-week iterations or the 1-week iteration, whatever they've chosen, is limiting them in some way, or some other structural piece of Scrum isn't making sense for that team, then they could consciously make that decision to switch. Teams that are unhappy with more restrictive processes for whatever reason. So for instance, teams might have been trying Scrum for 6 months, and they've been doing these estimation and sprint commitments, but every single sprint they only got half of what they promised done. And that can be very demoralizing. So rather than perhaps solve the underlying problems that might make Scrum work in that place, the team might just choose to go with a Kanban method that avoids the pain. And teams that are just extremely resistant to any form of process. So a new team spinning up, and they've heard bad things about Agile, they've heard bad things about Scrum, whatever. Kanban is so lightweight that you can just kind of say, let's start with this, and we can always improve and adapt and see what works as we go. And then finally, teams that are willing to extensively adapt Kanban to their needs. And so if you may not be a mature team, you may be fine with restricted process, but your team sees that Kanban would really work if you do all the steps necessary to make it work. But it does take an investment. So, to summarize, the answer to the question at the title of the talk, yes, a Kanban-based process can be an alternative to Scrum. However, the structured discipline of something like Scrum or extreme programming can often improve productivity. A lot of teams may be looking at Kanban as sort of an easier, more lax approach, more relaxing, whatever, and that might be true, but it might also hurt your productivity to give up the structure or the discipline. I had the good fortune to work on an extreme programming team for several years, and extreme programming takes a lot of discipline, and there's quite a bit of structure, and it's really challenging. But wow, the productivity was amazing, the fun was amazing. It really, really worked, but it took a lot of commitment to do that. Some teams here at the Foundation are using Kanban or something Kanban-based, something that resembles Kanban, something Kanban-ish. And then the final note is really every team is different. So Scrum might be the answer, Kanban might be the answer, extreme programming might be the answer, something in between all of that might be. But every team should start somewhere and continually improve and get to where they need to be. And I'll give you a quick sneak preview that there are some resources on the final slide. Other questions?
When you say the disciplined approach to Scrum or XP can really improve productivity, are there specific parts of those processes that you would pick out as the key things that are hard to do that really drive those improvements?
Well, I think looking at extreme programming, it would be pair programming on everything all the time, constantly refactoring your code, and automated tests for everything. That said, and it is highly productive but difficult to do. So that would be one example. I think in the case of, say, Scrum versus Kanban, having the time boxed iterations that you estimate and you commit to, that requires some practice and some discipline, and there are benefits of doing that, but there can't be benefits.
I always have questions. So, Grace, I think you said that there's some team. I mean, can you bring up a team that's using Kanban here? Because it seems like fortunately, this sort of sprint extension almost has the pieces we need. It has the limit in each column, but I don't think it has the diagram with the two arrows. I don't think it has that sort of incrementing backlog graphing.
Right.
So
Fabricator does not currently have cumulative flow diagrams, and in fact, it doesn't even have good
Cumulative flow
burn up
diagrams.
charts or burn down charts yet. It has some form of those, but we're not happy with them yet. We're working on that.
So have you asked the Christopher Johnson guy in Germany if you could consider doing it?
Yeah. There's a work underway right now to try to make that happen in the next month or so. At least to get improved burn up charts in the next month or so. Cumulative flow would come sometime after that.
Cool. And so, can you bring up maybe
so the
team using it?
The team practices group does a Kanban-ish process. The new discovery department that I work with uses a Kanban-based process. And Grace, you said,
Analytics engineering.
Can you show it? I mean,
yeah.
I'd be curious to see how you do it. Do you actually call it backlog? Do you have a separate board, or?
Right. So I think most of the teams that are doing it have one board for the product backlog, which is the long-term roadmap-y stuff, and then a board for the equivalent of a sprint, basically the 1 or 2 week horizon of current work being done. I know for the discovery, there's a series of sub-teams. So it's discovery something sprint are the different work being done boards, and then discovery has a product backlog as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so in this case of discovery, it was a new group, and so we decided to start with a relatively easy process and figure out whether Scrum is going to make sense for us or not. In the case of analytics, they were unhappy with Scrum and shifted to Kanban.
It just didn't work for us because we get interrupted. So we would commit to do things in a sprint, find out that we couldn't deliver them because we had to take care of event logging or some live system. And I think the team's less stressed out Kanban.
Yeah.
Arthur has a question. Arthur, you can just unmute.
Okay.
There's a delay.
Well, he says, how do you recommend managing continual improvement on a Kanban team?
Yeah, what Rachel said.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any brilliant answers to that. Retrospectives, regular retrospectives, the team would have to decide what frequency makes sense. Constantly encouraging the team members to be on the lookout for stuff that could be done differently, better, pain points, all of that.
I feel like this is one of the places where Kanban has a tendency to kind of break down, at least in its utility. It's no fault of Kanban's at all, but I feel like where I've seen teams try to get up and running with Kanban, they don't put anything in place in addition to the bare bones of what Kanban offers you to ensure that there is something around supporting continual improvement on the team. So I don't know if this is something that I would necessarily argue should be added to like a definition of Kanban, but I would urge anybody that is wanting to implement Kanban on their team to, at the very least, in addition to the couple of things that Kanban says you should do, make sure that there is somebody on the team who can own the responsibility for managing continual improvement on that team. Somebody who can periodically circle back with the team and say, hey, what's working well, what isn't, what can we do to actually improve? What are the kinds of policies we can put into place on our team to actually address our pain points? Because without that, then you just get stuck in this eternal rut of work in progress, and that's about it.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I would say, Kanban doesn't tell you to have a product owner equivalent kind of a person who's doing prioritizations, but you probably should have someone like that. And they don't say that you need to have somebody overseeing the process, but it's probably going to go smoother if you have the equivalent of a Scrum Master kind of a person. So yeah, I mean, Kanban really is it's reduce your batch size / WIP, and it's visualize your workflow, and it's continually improve. And if you're ignoring the continually improve part, then you're only doing 2/3 of Kanban. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
I think just to add to that, really we're talking about things in terms of tight feedback loops, and maybe this falls more under Scrumban than Kanban, but having a regular, even if it's not a person, having a regular meeting like a retrospective is a good way to just assess where you're at, and I don't see how that, that falls into the same categories as small batches and seeing things happen quickly so that you can adjust on the fly. If you're not having those retrospectives or whatever you want to call them, then you're not actually making that adjustment to the process itself. And we're talking about Kanban as a meta process that fits.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Kanban. There's a lot that Kanban doesn't say you have to do, but you better find a way to be doing the stuff that you can do. Yeah.
I'm still curious. Can you bring up a workboard, a Fabricator workboard using this and kind of show it? Because it's, basically, how do you do this CFD and measure your sort of cycle time with our current tools? Can you just not do it, or?
Yeah, the way the teams are, my understanding of the way the teams in the foundation that are doing it they're going about it is they're not really focused on the CFD. They're not focused on the measurement and the predictability aspect. It's really more, we've got all this work to do, and we've got to manage this flow of getting it done and get it done as efficiently as possible. So I think as a starting point, that's fine. It works, and there's nothing wrong with it. But I do see over time wanting to at least be able to get those measurements and start to visualize it better. So I would say it's not a prerequisite, but it would be a very nice thing.
Thanks.
Yeah, I can try to bring up a. Here we go. Bring up a board here. There. So this is just one of the sub teams of the discovery department, and so you can see this particular one has pretty simple backlog, essentially work to be done, in progress is work that's being done, needs review is work that's been done but needs review, and then done is ready for in this case, the product owner to sign off on it and say yes, the review is done. Actually, these stories here have been resolved in Fabricator, so they're crossed out, indicating that the product owner has already said yes, they are done and done the resolving.
Do you ever take them off the board?
Yeah, periodically we do sweeps, and that's another question too. Is because Kanban doesn't have sprints, they don't have these time box iterations. We're still trying to figure out, should we keep this one board forever, or should we rotate it out once a quarter, or should we rotate it out once a week? We have weekly meetings. We're sort of on a weekly cadence. So we haven't quite figured that out yet. But yeah, if this board, however long this board does exist, we'll be clearing out the done column from time to time.
It seems like you're using a combination of points and counts there. So the backlog is obviously not 4 stories, but you only have 1 story estimated. So
right. So the discovery department, which has only existed for less than a month, really, we've sort of said we're not going to deal with story points yet, and so whatever points are in there are one person chose to take the initiative to estimate something for his own purposes, but it's not part of our full process yet.
Can you change back from points to say just count the number of stories and say we only have 5 in progress? It doesn't seem. In other words, can you tell it forget about points, just use 5 in progress, 6 in the backlog or something?
That's what we do on our team.
Oh, I didn't know. Yeah.
So
I didn't know you could do that. That's what I'm asking. It's like,
well, this particular work board is a sprint, is checked as being a sprint. Do you guys not do a sprint?
No, we don't do a sprint, but I also realized that we don't use the points field. We have a little hack where we put it in the subject or the title. So we're able to limit the number of cards that are in different states.
Right. So
yeah, I think if it's not a sprint board, I think it just counts cards. Whereas if it is a sprint board, I think it starts counting points. But I'm not sure.
I believe that's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So is there anyone that's sort of responsible for making sure that tasks are like well defined enough and like small enough batches, or is that something that just sort of is just naturally sort of occurs as the team practices this?
Right. So Kanban and Scrum both tend to think of teams as being self-directed, and so that kind of issue would sort of get worked out by the team. I would say technically the product owner, if there is one, would be responsible for getting the story to that state, but at the same time, whoever's pulling those stories in would be responsible for making sure that it is well defined before they pull it in. Anything else?
Interesting.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for attending and great questions. And feel free to contact me afterwards, and I will be posting the slides somehow.
Thanks.